ever think about, someone's caught with illegal drugs,
Yeah.
and it's like, are they automatically going to be convicted on whatever the initial charges are,
Right.
or can they like try to negotiate
Sure.
to get a lighter punishment? And what happens if the people who are prosecuting them are like, no way
Yeah.
to that negotiation? Well, today
Yeah.
we are looking at a Supreme Court case from the Philippines
Good.
that deals with this exact issue about plea bargaining when it comes to drug offenses.
Okay.
So yeah, we're going to really break down this whole case for you.
All right.
We're going to look at what happened in the lower courts, what was the big legal question that the Supreme Court had to answer, and then what did their decision ultimately mean? And this all helps us understand how plea bargaining works,
Yeah.
especially in the context of drug cases in the Philippines.
Makes sense.
So the case is Glen Orda y Loyola v. People of the Philippines, GR No 258894, January 30, 2023.
All right.
So let's jump into the specifics. What exactly was Mr. Loyola accused of?
So Glen Orda y Loyola was actually charged with 3 separate violations of Republic Act No. 9165,
Okay.
which is the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002.
All right.
This all happened back on February 25, 2016 in Roxas City.
Okay.
The first charge under Criminal Case No, C-8716, was violation of Section 5.
Okay.
Specifically, he was accused of selling 0.310 grams of methamphetamine hydrochloride, more commonly known as shabu.
Yeah.
The second charge,
Okay.
Criminal Case No,
Huh.
C-8816.
Okay.
That was a violation of Section 11.
Right.
In this case, he was accused of possessing 0.164 grams of suspected shabu,
Okay.
and this was found in 6 sachets.
Got it.
And then finally, the third charge,
Yeah.
Criminal Case No.
Yeah.
C-8916 was for violation of Section 12.
All right.
He was accused of possessing drug paraphernalia,
Okay.
which included a glass pipe, aluminum foil, and a lighter.
All right. So some pretty serious charges there.
Yeah.
And so he initially pled not guilty, right? What made him think about doing the whole plea bargaining thing later?
Yeah, so at his arraignment, he initially pleaded not guilty to all 3 charges.
Okay.
However, as the trial went on,
Yeah.
he decided to explore the option of plea bargaining under AM number 2, 1803-16 SC.
Okay.
Now, this is a set of rules from the Supreme Court
Yeah.
specifically outlining the framework for plea bargaining in drug cases.
Interesting.
His proposal was pretty specific
Okay.
for those charges related to sale and possession, C-8716 and C-8816.
Right.
He offered to plead guilty to 2 counts of violating Section 12,
Okay.
which is possession of equipment apparatus and other paraphernalia for dangerous drugs.
Okay.
The penalty for that is actually lighter. It ranges from 6 months and 1 day to 4 years of imprisonment and a fine of P10,000 to P50,000.
Right.
Now, for the third charge, that drug paraphernalia possession charge,
Yeah, C-8916.
exactly, C-8916,
Yeah.
he offered to plead guilty to violating Section 15,
Gotcha.
which is use of dangerous drugs.
Okay, so big difference in potential penalties there.
Huge difference.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier that there was also this whole drug dependency evaluation.
Right.
Like, how did that play into the whole situation?
Yeah, that's a crucial part of the Supreme Court's plea bargaining framework. So Loyola underwent this evaluation, and he was diagnosed with methamphetamine use disorder mild and recommended for outpatient rehabilitation.
Okay.
This seems to be in line with his proposal to plead to lesser charges that might focus more on rehabilitation than just locking him up for a long time.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
It sounds like a pretty reasonable approach given the situation.
Yeah.
But the prosecutor was like, nope.
Oh, yeah, they were not on board.
What were their reasons for saying no to the plea deal?
Well, they had 2 main arguments.
Okay.
First, for that charge of selling shabu,
Criminal Case No?
C-8716.
Exactly, C-8716.
They cited Department of Justice Circular No. 27,
Okay.
which was issued in 2018.
Right.
And this circular had its own guidelines for plea bargaining in drug cases. So for violations of Section 5, like selling drugs, it only allowed a plea bargain to Section 11.3,
Okay.
which is possession of dangerous drugs,
Got it.
but with a much higher penalty. We're talking 12 years and 1 day to 20 years imprisonment
Wow.
and a fine of P300,000.
So a big difference.
Yeah, very different.
Okay, what was their second argument?
So the second argument applied to all 3 cases. They argued that Loyola's proposal went against Section 2, Rule 116
Okay.
of the revised rules on criminal procedure.
All right.
Their interpretation of this rule was that both the prosecutor and the police officers involved had to consent before someone could plead guilty to a lesser offense.
Yeah, interesting.
So you could see it was a bit of a clash between the Supreme Court's rules and the Department of Justice's guidelines.
Okay, so what happened when all this went before the regional trial court?
So in February 2019, the regional trial court, Branch 16 in Roxas City, actually granted Loyola's plea bargaining proposal.
Oh, wow.
The RTC judge said that AM No 1803-16 SC, being from the Supreme Court under their constitutional authority, actually had more weight than the DOJ Circular No 27.
Interesting.
The court also decided that they didn't need the police officer's consent, especially since violations of RA NOWO 90165 are considered public crimes. And the public prosecutor represents the state's interest. So based on the plea bargain, Loyola was sentenced. And the RTC also ordered him to do outpatient drug treatment.
Got it.
The people then filed a motion for reconsideration. But the RTC denied it.
Okay, so that's a pretty big win for Loyola at the trial court.
Yeah, for sure.
But the prosecution didn't give up. They took it to the Court of Appeals.
They did.
What was the initial decision there?
So initially, in November 2019, the Court of Appeals dismissed the people's petition for certiorari. Now, a petition for certiorari is basically a request for a higher court to review the decision of a lower court. So in this case, by dismissing it, the Court of Appeals was saying, we uphold what the RTC decided. They said that the RTC didn't commit grave abuse of discretion. Now, that's a really high bar for error when granting the plea bargain. They emphasized that under AM No 1803-16 SC, plea bargaining falls under the trial court's judicial discretion. The Court of Appeals even went as far as to suggest that judges could overrule objections if those objections weakened the government's efforts against illegal drugs.
Interesting. So another win for Loyola, reinforcing the idea that the judge has a big role in these plea bargains.
Yeah, absolutely. But then this is where things take a turn. The Court of Appeals changed their mind, right?
They did.
Tell me about that. So after the people filed a motion for reconsideration, the Court of Appeals issued an amended decision in July 2021. This time, they completely reversed their previous ruling and ordered that the trial should proceed on those original, more serious charges against Loyola. Their reasoning now was that a plea to a lesser offense needed the prosecutor's agreement no matter what.
Interesting.
They also stated that DOJ Circular No 27 was simply an internal guideline for prosecutors. They said it didn't go against the Supreme Court's rulemaking authority.
Got it.
So they concluded that the RTC had committed a grave abuse of discretion by approving the plea bargain without the prosecution's consent.
So that's a huge setback for Loyola.
Definitely.
I mean, now he's back to facing those original, much harsher penalties.
Right.
So this is where the Supreme Court steps in.
Yeah, the final stage.
What was the main question that they had to figure out?
The big question was, did the Court of Appeals make a mistake by overturning the RTC's decision? Remember, the RTC granted Loyola's plea bargain, even though the prosecutor objected. It really boils down to who has the final say in these plea agreements. You've got the prosecution, the trial courts, and then the Supreme Court's own procedural rules.
Okay, so a power struggle in a way.
Yeah, you could see it that way.
So what was the Supreme Court's final decision?
So the Supreme Court actually reversed the amended decision of the Court of Appeals. They sided with the regional trial court's original decision, but they provided some important clarifications. In their decision, they referred back to their rulings in two similar cases, Monteiro v. People and Baldadero v. People. These were decided in July 2022. And they also dealt with plea bargaining in drug cases.
Got it.
And the whole question of, the Supreme Court's rules versus the DOJ's guidelines. But the Supreme Court pointed out something really important. They mentioned that the DOJ issued Circular No 18 in May 2022. And this new circular actually amended the earlier DOJ Circular No 27. What's important is that Circular No 18 aligns with the Supreme Court's framework, AM No 1803-16 SC. When it comes to acceptable plea bargains for Section 5 violations. So now it allows for a plea to Section 12,
Okay.
which is what Loyola wanted in the first place.
Oh, so the very thing the prosecutor was using to object
Yeah,
it had been changed
exactly.
by the time the Supreme Court made their decision.
Right.
That's a big twist.
Yeah, it was a game changer.
So what did the Supreme Court say about the prosecution's objection then?
Well, because of that new circular,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court basically said that the objection in criminal case nan,
Yeah.
C-8716, was withdrawn.
Okay.
It was based on that old circular
Right.
that was no longer valid.
Makes sense.
The Supreme Court also clarified that while both the accused and the prosecution usually had to agree on a plea bargain
Yeah.
under Section 2, Rule 116,
Uh-huh.
but they made it clear that the final decision to approve or reject it
Yeah.
is up to the trial court judge.
So the judge has the power.
Exactly. They have the final say.
Wow. So the Supreme Court really emphasized that the judge has the final say.
They did.
Even if the prosecutor disagrees.
Yeah. And they also reminded everyone
Uh-huh.
that the Supreme Court has the power to make rules about court procedures,
Right.
including plea bargaining.
Okay.
This comes from the Constitution.
So they were basically saying our rules are the ones that matter.
Yeah. In a nutshell.
So what were those guidelines from the Monteiro case?
Oh, yeah. Those are really important.
Like they mentioned.
So those guidelines include things like the accused has to file a written motion for plea bargaining.
Okay.
The lesser offense has to be something that's necessarily included in the original charge, meaning you can't commit the original crime
Yeah.
without also committing the lesser one.
Gotcha.
They also said that drug dependency assessments should be considered.
Okay.
And the agreement between the prosecution and the accused
Mm-hmm.
is ultimately up to the court's approval.
Right.
The court gets to decide.
Yeah.
And if the prosecution objects, their objections have to be valid and based on evidence.
Okay.
Like if the accused is a repeat offender,
Right.
or if there's really strong evidence of guilt for the original charge.
Gotcha.
And of course, the plea bargain has to follow the Supreme Court's framework.
Okay.
The big takeaway from all this is that the trial court can actually overrule objections from the prosecution, especially if those objections are just based on internal DOJ rules
Okay.
that don't line up with the Supreme Court's framework.
Interesting. So it's not an automatic plea bargain for Loyola,
Right.
but he gets another chance
He does.
under the right set of rules.
Exactly.
And the judge ultimately decides.
Yeah. It all comes down to the judge's discretion.
So what are like the big picture legal lessons
key takeaways
from all of this?
So there are three main points here.
Okay.
First, we see the Supreme Court's rulemaking power in action.
Okay.
This case really reaffirms that they have the sole authority to make the rules for court procedures, including plea bargaining,
Right.
and their rules trump everyone else's.
Got it.
Second, we see the importance of judicial discretion in plea bargaining.
So even though the prosecutor usually has to agree,
Right.
the trial court ultimately decides whether to accept the deal.
Okay. And they can even overrule the prosecutor under certain circumstances.
Interesting.
And finally, we see the harmonization of DOJ guidelines. The Supreme Court pointed out that DOJ, 18-teen,
Yeah.
brought the DOJ's internal rules in line with their framework,
Right.
which is a good thing.
It makes things clearer.
Exactly. It promotes consistency.
So this case really shows how our legal system works. All these different players, the prosecution, the courts.
The DOJ.
It makes you think, with the Supreme Court emphasizing the judge's role and the DOJ updating their guidelines, I mean, how will this affect drug cases in the future?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. And could it shift the power dynamic when it comes to plea bargaining?
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah. A lot to consider.
A lot to unpack there.
So what do you think?
Yeah, let us know in the comments.
Share your thoughts about this case.
Yeah.
Give us a favorite if you found this deep dive interesting.
And to recap those key takeaways.
Yeah, always good to recap.
Remember, the Supreme Court makes the rules for court procedures.
Number one.
Trial courts have the final say on plea bargains, even if the prosecutor objects sometimes.
Right.
And the DOJ's rules are now aligned with the Supreme Court's framework.
Makes sense.
So if you want to stay up to date on Philippine law and understand all these complex legal issues, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive.
We go deep into all sorts of landmark cases and legal doctrines.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.